Right, so welcome everybody, thank you so much for coming along. So yes, we've been working on a project in the last 4 months or so on quantitative code ecology. What is quantitative code ecology? Essentially that manuscripts by numbers, doing things with manuscripts and thinking about numbers about them. So I will talk you very briefly through the motivations for the project and the project itself and some of the outputs, and then we'll look at some of these exciting things here. So, big data. What is big data? Big data is all around us today. There are big data at Bodleian. So there are 11,115 individually catalogued manuscripts in the Bodleian's medieval manuscript catalogue. Not all of those, of course, are directly underneath our feet. Lots of them are in the college libraries as well. Within our authority data, there are 54,000 individually catalogued texts across the different manuscripts, of which 12,000 of those are distinct texts, and just over 7,000 people. And of those manuscripts then, about 1,600 are fully digitized. So there is a lot of data for us to play with. It's still obviously a work in progress, particularly with things like digitization, which is building up. But there are a lot of data within the catalogues. The problem that this project has been trying to overcome then is that the data are stored in TI, which is fantastic if you're like us and you love TI and you spend your days looking at TI, but if you're not us, then it's not a particularly helpful format. It's really difficult for students to access. It's something that not many people know even exists, and so it's quite hard to get access to those data. Medieval Bodleian, of course, as well, is fantastic. Really accessible, really human readable, really useful as a finding aid for manuscripts and manuscript contents and things like that, but it's not very good at cross-comparison, which is not what it was designed for. So it's very difficult to compare across different manuscripts and see how they differ. So our approach is then to take the TEI data and to turn them into tabular data, so spreadsheets essentially, and to make them as human readable but also machine readable as possible. So to sort of bridge that gap if we can, in a way that really allows for cross-comparison between manuscripts. It's not the perfect solution. The idea is not to replace any of the existing things, particularly difficulties of many-to-one handling. So if you've got lots of contents, lots of different texts in a particular manuscript, how do you get that into a single field in an Excel spreadsheet? That's quite a difficult question. So it's not the perfect solution, but it is an additional helpful solution that we think so far has been quite successful and has been really good in terms of getting students access to this large quantity of manuscript data. On every single slide, there is a link to our GitHub. I won't go there because we don't have time, but please go download all the data. It is all there already. So, just to show you very briefly what the spreadsheets look like, here is one. So, they are absolutely massive. It's a 40 megabyte file. But we have various different things, including in our overview tab, stuff like the metadata. You have origin information, so you have dates, you get provenance, you get acquisition, you get information about the contents, including language and things like that, music, decoration, code ecological details, so extent and things along those lines, and support, paleographic details, and then measurements of things like binding, of leaves, of the text block, etc., etc. And there are lots of other tabs that give you a little bit more information in that. So if you are looking for particular manuscripts in Bodleian, please go and use those data. They're there, freely available, very exciting. Fine. So let's move on to some manuscripts. So the idea was for us to think about manuscripts that have jumped out of the data as being particularly interesting in one way or another. So the first one that I want to show you is the one right down the end, which is MS Lat B4, which is, as far as we're able to tell from the data, the manuscript with the most lines per page in the Bodleian. So it's a 13th century Italian manuscript, Bernard of Parma's apparatus to Pope Gregory the Ninth's decretals, and apparently it has 105 plus, the cataloguer says, lines per page in the apparatus surrounding it. So do come and have a look at that at some point. It is quite extreme. And we can see on the graph, love the graph, that there are some really quite extreme examples. So obviously our manuscript is right here up at the top, but there are a couple of manuscripts, not many, that come close to it in terms of numbers of lines per page, and the majority seem to be between, what's that, about 13, 14, and about 65, 70, and there are a couple of extremely short ones as well that don't have many at all. Fine. The next exciting thing that jumped out is the thinnest binding. why not? We have the data, we might as well use them. So that is this one, which is, yes, it's a 15th century Italian abbreviated Psalter. This one I think is really exciting. Closed, it's very beautiful, open as well, but even closed, it's got this gorgeous binding, which was repaired relatively recently, and you can see the bits of wood that have been spliced together. And yes, 9mm of binding when it's closed together, which makes it very, very huge. Okay, the third one I wanted to talk to you about. The greatest number of columns. So, a 14th century Bible concordance, this one. That's what it says on the tin. There are 5. And there are only, I think, 4 manuscripts, catalogues in the Bodleian collections that have that many columns per page, which is quite exciting. Most of them, of course, as we can see, are either 1 or 2, most commonly 2. That's the most frequent. Cool. Matthew?
Over to me. Thank you very much, then. One of the interesting things you can do with the data is look at the size of manuscripts in terms of big and small, but also in terms of the shape of them, so how sort of tall and thin they are. You'll see from the data there's a sort of very sort of clear line of fit for the sort of average size of the average ratio between the height and width of a book. It's about 0.7. There's a fair amount of variation around it, but it's quite unusual to have a very tall and very narrow book like that one there. So. Don't know if we've got
the orange.
Yeah, so that's up there. A real outlier in terms of the data. And something you can do with the data is to work out, what kinds of books have that sort of format. Are there any commonalities between them? So that's a manuscript of Virgil, partly 15th century, partly 13th century, and there are quite a few manuscripts of classical literature in that format. Why? Good question. Something to look into, but. You can explore that using the data. Biggest margins. So this is something else you can explore. The ratio of the page size to the size of the written space. And it's something that varies quite a lot between different manuscripts. So you'll find manuscripts where the ratio is about 0.2 and it goes up to about 0.8. So filling a fifth of the page as opposed to filling 4/5 of the page. There's a lot of variation there. As you might expect, sort of fancy books like books of hours tend to have a lot of empty space, but not just those. So that's a manuscript of Virgil. The first page throws up an interesting data question because you can see that there are sort of 2 sizes of text. There's a sort of narrow column for the verse and a wider space for the prose introduction to the books. I think the cataloguer took the size of the narrow verse column as the measurement, which is why it shows up in the data as having very, very wide margins. They're not perhaps quite as wide as it seems, because in fact the ruled space is bigger than the verse actually fills. So there are problems that one gets into with the data when you dig down into the individual manuscripts. But nevertheless, a kind of manuscript with big margins. Is it because it was a fancy manuscript? Is it because there was going to be commentary in the margins? Don't know. Again, more questions that you can explore using the data. And the last one, tallest lines. So how large are the lines of text in a medieval manuscript typically? That looks like, so that's, yes, height divided by columns, lines and columns. There's quite a lot of variation. A sort of typical height is about 5mm for text. This is much larger. Again, there's a sort of slight distortion in the data because this has blank space. It's an unfinished musical manuscript. So there would originally have been music between the lines. So the space between the lines isn't quite as large as it seems if you just do the statistical thing of dividing number of lines by empty space. So again, be careful with the data and look at the manuscript to interpret it fully. But still, quite big lines. So yes, some kinds of manuscripts that are designed for use by many people or use in certain situations naturally have larger lines than ones that are designed for study in a small space. Please, as Seb says, download the data and explore these questions yourselves. Thank you very much.